He has lost half of his weight. So, but in the medium or too long run, countries will start trading around the US. And this has already happened. About 40% of the world today are not on the SWIFT platform. The BRICS nations have already taken over. China in the last 20 years has been building infrastructure all over the world. Rail infrastructure, seaports. You know the quarry by the Panama Canal. You know what China did? China went to Mexico and built one of the largest ports in the world and put a rail line attached to it. So they don't even need to use the Panama Canal. So you see, this guy is just talking about the past. People have moved on. And that is why everybody in China is okay. This morning I think it's 104 now with China. So as we navigate these turbulent waters, let us take lessons from the past. Be unpredictable and avoid divisive governance style. This is for our government style that we are witnessing under the current American administration that serves as a cautionary tale. We must instead prioritize consistency, inclusive governance, one that respects democratic institutions and values and input on all Nigerians. So we should avoid that kind of voice vote we had in the House of Reps when our television clearly showed that there were more empty seats than people. If you were going to vote on a constitutional matter, we expect them to take a roll call so that we can actually be sure that we have complied with our laws. So our press has a duty to point out all this. So in conclusion, the road ahead may be fraught with challenges, but it's also rich with promise. With strategic foresight, resolute cooperation, and an unwavering commitment to sustainable practices, I'm confident that we can confront these trials and emerge as a resilient nation. Together, let us pave a way for an economy that not only survives adversity, but truly thrives, a testament to the indomitable spirit of our people. I've already mentioned Dangote at the eighth wonder. There's nothing like that anywhere in the world. So even if you have nothing to brag, anytime you go abroad, use that. I went to Michigan. I went to one refinery and I said, this is so small. Have you seen Dangote? I brought out the picture, I flashed it. All of them were looking. So you must talk about yourself. So generally, experience teaches us that decisions and actions based on sentiments. This is very important. Ignorance are always unhelpful. As we see in the USA's gamble with tariffs. Instead, nations should deploy knowledge, ethics. This is very important. Because in this regime there, you have all the conspiracy theorists who are telling you something that is so obvious, the theory is like this. Then an experience devoid of bias in the decision-making process. I gave an example here. I actually saw this at 4 a.m. this morning when I was writing this paper. I like to write in the morning. He said the judge asked the killer of former Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, why did you kill Sadat? He said to him, because he is secular. The judge replied, what does secular mean? The killer said, I don't know. In the case of the attempted assassination of late Egyptian writer Naguib Mahfouz, the judge asked the man who stabbed Mahfouz, why did you stab him? The accused said, because of his novel, The Children of Our Neighborhood. The judge asked him, have you read the novel? The accused said, no. Another judge asked the terrorist, who killed the Egyptian writer, Faraj Farah? Why did you murder Faraj Farah? The terrorist replied, because he's unfaithful. The judge asked him, how did you know he was unfaithful? The accused replied, according to the books he wrote. Then the judge said, in which of his books did you know he's unfaithful? The judge said, I haven't read any of his books. The judge now said, how? The judge replied, I can't read or write. See, what this tells you is when you are ignorant, you are biased, you are sentimental, you are incompetent, you have no knowledge. You know, when you appoint someone without knowledge to take over your affairs, especially under our constitution, they say with secondary school you can become president. That is too small for a country like Nigeria. You have seen the quality of characters we have there. I have a lot of them are friends. I hope they still call me their friend. But honestly, I'm not proud of the kind of people that spend more time talking about their sexual accomplices. You heard it now, the biggest scandal there. If these people are really working, should that be the problem? It is lack of work. If you look at our two national assemblies, look at them. Under our constitution, show me why should we have two. The only difference between the House of Reps and the Senate is that the Senate does the constitutional ministerial approval, while the House of Reps does the FCT. They are the house for the FCT for their budget. Is that two jobs so difficult to compress into one body? So this is the problem. Our government is too expensive for us. And if we must send legislators to the National Assembly, it should be paid for from the state that sent them. So if they know, so then go and start doing what they are doing. So what we are trying to say is our government structure is too large, difficult for our budget cannot even have it. Because it's too much for us. So we need to find a way, especially with what is happening in America now. Democracy is gone. If that is what we are relying on, our source is under fire. And a time will come, we'll be embarrassed to say we are democratic. I'm not saying we should choose authoritarianism or a different thing that will not serve us. This is the time for us to have that dialogue, start thinking what alternatives that will suit us, that is not too expensive, and the people should be there part-time. This idea of putting people full-time, that's why they are complaining about the quarrel about Natasha and whatever. Because if they meet once a week, I'm sure they will not see each other to that extent. So it's very important we take this seriously. And very importantly, we in the private sector, last year, we got almost 30 trillion from tax, FRS, from the private sector. The custom collected under 6 trillion. If you check the budget, there's nothing for us. All the money is shared by the 36 messiahs who will sit down. They are not involved in any productive sector. Even when they are work contract, they will call press conference. Even when it is, we all know it's inflated, and they will now also call press conference to come and cut the tape. So when we are working, we are paying the taxes, we are building our roads. If you check everywhere in Nigeria, 90% of access to any factory, the road is not tarred. You go and check. So this is it. You must put money in the productive sector. If you tell me today you have a 13 trillion deficit in the current budget, you want to make it, I can use one of my sectors to make up for it. We let the government tell me, okay, fine, we'll guarantee you reasonable price for loans. And I will tell you that 13 trillion, two companies can bring it out. Dangote can bring it out for us. So why don't we invest in things that will do us good instead of trying to buy oil from Malta? Are you growing industries in Malta at your own expense? And some people will come in national television and you press, you will carry them without stoning them. That they should say we prefer the petrol from outside than our own. I don't understand. So this is what I'm saying, and this is what we're trying to use this platform to resolve. That we're very happy with these discussions here, and that we should live here with a resolution to be agents for our country. Because with all of us that went to build us in America, and I go now, anytime you use somebody's strange land to do something for yourself and you call it home, the only ones, even your houseboy will tell you are a fool. And we have seen it with America now. So those of you that have things in America, bring them home. There's no need. I'm not going there. Because even people that wrote articles in 1 year, you heard the way they kidnapped the woman, you saw it on television. So even this one can get me in trouble, I know. So I'm not going. So if you want to go, it's your luck. But what is important, let's concentrate on ourselves. So on the lighter note, I'm almost one paragraph rounding off. I said the above, ignorance is the reason, hate based on what we heard about them in most cases without evidence. Not that we know. So you can see what lack of knowledge, ignorance can create. So the above cause aligns with Nigeria's current experiment with Fulani headmen. Those people are afraid to talk about it, so I'll talk. Fulani headmen, the new profession of hunting, they are now hunters. They've left cattle, this thing. And instead of the traditional cattle rearing, while we are still awaiting the outcome of the sudden hunting expeditions in our southern states by these emerging hunters, I want to use the opportunity to advise the government to manage disputes between the local communities and the hunters more transparently. Because I fully condemn what happened in Uromi, because we should never do self-help. But one thing I've seen, the trajectory, anytime this thing happens, especially against the hunters, the chief of army staff will do his own press conference, the president will talk, everybody will talk, they will be crying. You can see the governor run immediately to Kano to beg. But when people from that side, don't mention any side, though, please. When people from that side invade, nobody cries like this. No governor comes from that side to commiserate us. The chief of army staff does not see it. So you the press, what are you doing? You see, why I talk like this is, in any nation, a nation without a press is a dead one. You are complaining that you have lost you cannot sell newspaper again. This is a bigger matter than newspaper. If you pursue social and economic development rights, you write about these things. We will not only subscribe to your blog, we will give you money, we will support you as private businesses, we will fund you. You have no business going to government for anything. Sell your intellectual properties to us. Represent us. Represent the poor people of Nigeria, the people who cannot speak for themselves. These innocent people that are killed every day on the slightest thing. If I find a stranger in my farm from another place holding gun, the man says he's hunting. I've never seen the antelope they kill one day. And if you go on Instagram, painfully, you see this people bragging. I can't say it here, what they say. Bragging about how they are killing and raping our mothers. So, you are complaining about no food, productivity is down. This is the reason. From Bayelsa, even my chambers in Bayelsa, I cannot go to farm. Bayelsa, actually, this land in Bayelsa is not from here to Falamo. People cannot go to farm. So we know the problem. But our government behaves in a chameleon way. You are afraid of one group. How? So please, don't take the law into your hands. Anytime you receive anything, report it. And you, the press, have a duty to right the wrong. You don't write only one side. Go to the genesis. If you go to Benue, you go to a Plateau State, you cannot imagine what these things have caused for Nigeria. So, in the above situations, we also encourage and appeal to our local communities to avoid self-help and violence in their dealings with these emerging hunters. Because I think this hunting is a very profitable, I don't know whether. So the above example highlights the complexities and the challenges extremist ideologies, bias in private and public decision making, and the impact on individual and society. They also underscore the importance of education. Because, especially in the north, if we don't educate them, Nigeria will go nowhere. Because one person can control a whole community there. So until we educate them, because the day of election, they will just line up. One person will say, I go and vote for that Makari. That's all. So you must find a way to be inclusive, listen more to people who are less than us, and try and work with them. So this also underscores the importance of education, critical thinking, nuanced understanding in leadership of a society to prevent acts of violence and poor economic decisions like the USA is currently experiencing by imposing tariffs on 185 countries on April 2nd, which included McDonald's Island, which only have penguins. So the penguins are going to pay 10% to Donald Trump. And they have never traded with America, which shows you that the whole thing was done arbitrarily. And today, effective from today, 60 countries are starting with the tariffs today. And as of this morning, Russia is now 104%. So we don't know where they will end. So I want to congratulate the organizer of this event, especially the keynote speaker, Mr. Yemi Kale, whom we have, as a former statistician, I've told him that he has come with a whole bag of statistics so that we can all learn from him. I also congratulate our brother, Mr. Franklin Ungu, who is going to be the, I think he's coordinating the section. Then I also acknowledge Ms. Demi Semande. Hope I got that right. I'm sorry if I didn't get it right. Then Dr. Tayo Aduloju, CEO of NSG. Dr. Muda Yusuf, this one is our own. So, Dr. Femi Egbeshola, Chief Davison Alaribe, and Mrs. Bumi Kuku, and Mr. Roger Brown. And I want to also welcome all of us to the 2025 Vanguard Economist Discourse. Thank you very much.
Chief Economist and Managing Director of the African Export and Import Bank, and has been noted here earlier, he was formerly Nigeria's Statistician General, Dr. Yemi Kale. Please put your hands together for him as he delivers his speech.
And good afternoon. Respectfully allow me to stand on existing protocols already established. When I got here this morning, I told the management staff of Vanguard that I'm no longer controversial, so I would behave myself as much as possible. And their response was, controversy is what sells papers. Against that backdrop, in that case, I would be a little bit controversial, but I would take the chairman's cue. I would also not mention anybody's names as I do this. Let me start by expressing my gratitude to the management of Vanguard newspapers for affording me the honor of delivering this year's keynote address at the Vanguard Economic Discourse. It's a privilege I do not take lightly. The sub-theme of our discourse this year, economic hardship and pathways to recovery, speaks not only to our current struggles, but also our unwavering hope as Nigerians for a resilient, inclusive, and prosperous Nigeria. The Nigerian economy in 2025, much like its counterparts across the continent, and a lot of this has been mentioned today, and the broader global economy stands at a critical strategic juncture. The confluence of heightened global volatility, systemic domestic vulnerabilities, and a shifting geopolitical equilibrium has redefined the parameters within which we now operate. These dynamics have disrupted traditional policy levers, complicated macroeconomic forecasting, and constrained the latitude available for both fiscal and monetary interventions. In this environment, a business as usual approach is no longer tenable. Rather, what is required is a comprehensive orientation of our economic strategy anchored on structural reforms, anchored on productivity, enhanced innovation, and a deliberate pivot towards inclusive, human-centered development. The success of this transition will hinge not only on the policies we enact as a country, but also on the institutional capacity, on interagency coordination, and on political resolve, which we must bring to bear in executing them. So I had prepared slides for presentation, but I was informed late last night that a conventional speech format delivery would be more appropriate for today's setting. So as a result, I spent the better part of last night reworking to convert my slides into this speech. But that said, this was a particularly challenging paper for me to put together, given how things are changing so frequently in the global and domestic environment. So each time I reviewed global and domestic economic indicators or development, new data points and economic signals emerged, either internationally or within Nigeria, that demanded a reassessment of data and analysis and conclusions. So the world is in flux currently. The signals are very mixed, and the outcome is riddled with contradictions. If I were to summarize the defining theme of 2025 in a single word, it will be turbulence, closely followed by uncertainty. Now, these are not just buzzwords. They are real forces shaping global and domestic economic behavior and outcomes. And for developing economies like ours in Nigeria, which are already navigating significant structural and institutional weaknesses, this turbulence creates profound challenges. Planning, whether you're a household or you're a business or even government, in such an environment becomes exponentially more difficult. This is because economic uncertainty disrupts decision making across the board. Households, businesses, governments, investors, financial institutions all behave differently under conditions of volatility and uncertainty, and often in ways that reinforce this economic fragility. Households, for instance, tend to reduce discretionary spending and increase precautionary savings during periods of uncertainty. That is, of course, if they even have any disposable income to save in the first place. For the vast majority of Nigerians who live hand to mouth, even minor economic disruptions can be catastrophic. We all witnessed this vividly during the COVID-19 pandemic, when lockdowns, though necessary, quickly escalated into widespread unrest. The core issue wasn't really non-compliance, it was economic desperation. For many Nigerians, the ability to earn a living is not guaranteed tomorrow, it is negotiated on a daily basis. So taking even a single day off work is often not a choice, but a luxury that they simply can't afford. The stark reality is this: most Nigerians lack the economic buffers, be it savings, social protection, or institutional support required to withstand microeconomic shocks, however temporary. Unfortunately, too often, policy responses, however well-meaning, fail to adequately grasp the depth and immediacy of this reality. There is a persistent tendency among governments and elite decision makers to underestimate the lived experience of hardship at the base of the socioeconomic pyramid. We often respond not with foresight, but with reaction. So interventions are frequently triggered only after economic distress erupts into some form of social unrest, at which point palliative measures are deployed hastily and unevenly, rather than preemptively cushioning citizens against foreseeable disruptions. What is required, therefore, is a decisive shift towards anticipatory governance, where policies are not only designed to respond to crises, but to foresee and mitigate them before they inflict widespread harm. This means proactively cushioning vulnerable populations. It means strengthening social safety nets. It means reinforcing public trust in state institutions. What is particularly concerning here in the Nigerian context is that in many cases, the disruption is not an unanticipated external shock beyond the government's control. Often the hardship stems from policies introduced by the state itself. So these are not unanticipated events. They are actually planned decisions. Yet, even then, despite the policies being needed, the necessary safeguards are either absent or poorly implemented or deprioritized. In some instances, the likely socio-economic impact is understood, but there is insufficient political will or insufficient fiscal space or administrative capacity to do what is required to protect the most affected. And in Nigeria's case, the most affected constitutes the majority of our population. Back to economic behavior. In uncertain times, like I mentioned, households also delay major financial decisions and shift preferences towards job security, often seeking refuge in the public sector. It is better, they reason, to earn a modest but stable income rather than chase higher ones that may not last. I'm sure many of us have friends or family members that have responded in this way. In high inflation environments like Nigeria's, economic agents would hoard foreign exchange, would hoard durable goods to preserve value. What's the result? consumer demand softens, GDP growth slows, private sector investment declines, unemployment rises, and poverty becomes more entrenched. The outcome is unmistakable: hardship, deep, persistent, and widespread, and felt most acutely at the household level. Businesses, too, adapt defensively in environments characterized by uncertainty and macroeconomic turbulence. Faced with volatile market conditions, unpredictable policy shifts, and elevated costs, firms often adopt a risk-averse posture. Hiring plans are deferred, investment pipelines are stalled, and operation expenditures are trimmed to preserve liquidity. The emphasis shifts from growth to survival and from innovations to cost containment. This weakness, which weakens private sector activity, it limits job creation and suppresses productivity and competitiveness. Governments, meanwhile, face their own set of constraints in uncertain economic environments. Revenue forecasting becomes increasingly unreliable due to volatile commodity prices, due to exchange rate fluctuations, and inconsistent tax performance. In response, policy often shifts towards reactionary, short-term, and often poorly thought out and often badly implemented populist interventions, such as expanding public sector employment, increasing cash reserves, transfers rather, and in more constrained scenarios resorting to monetary financing to bridge fiscal gaps. Does this sound familiar? Again, I'm not mentioning any names. While these measures may provide temporary relief or political expediency, they carry significant long-term costs. They exacerbate fiscal deficits, they undermine macroeconomic stability, and erode the credibility of public institutions. Just as importantly, such reactive policies can crowd out productive investments, they can distort incentives and reduce the confidence of both domestic and international investors. In effect, they attempt to manage volatility and curtail economic hardship through short-term, often politically expedient means, often ends up entrenching it. Meanwhile, investors react to the environment by seeking safe havens, demanding higher returns for risk and favoring short-term portfolio investments over longer-term foreign direct investment. The consequences are familiar and deeply disruptive. Capital flight accelerates, asset valuations decline, and renewed pressure mounts on the domestic currency. In effect, investor behavior becomes both a reflection of and a reinforcement of underlying fragilities, tightening the feedback loop between macroeconomic instability and constrained investment flows. Finally, financial institutions tighten lending conditions. They raise interest rates and retreat to low-risk assets. Credit becomes more expensive and less available, weakening financial intermediation and further depressing economic activity. In many ways, this sounds like a description of Nigeria's economic condition for most of its existence, not necessarily in 2025. But this time, it is also a description of the global economy and what it's going through. The same forces acting globally are amplifying our domestic vulnerabilities. And in countries like Nigeria, where the economic base is already fragile, where buffers are weak, and where the social fabric is under strain, the compounding effects of uncertainty can therefore be devastating. What policymakers, or as policymakers and business leaders, what they must reframe, we must reframe, as policymakers and business leaders, we must reframe our understanding of economic disruption, not as a technical challenge, but as a social emergency. And so with that rather sobering context, I will structure today's lecture around 6 segments. Firstly, a review of the global African macroeconomic landscape in 2025, so as to understand the external environment shaping Nigeria's economy in 2025 and the hardships we face. Then I would analyze the Nigeria's economic performance in 2024, so as to establish a factual baseline. I'll move to highlight key structural challenges, essentially a deep dive into domestic weaknesses that limit resilience and exacerbate current hardships we are facing. Outlook for 2025, brief projections for growth, inflation, fiscal dynamics, capital inflows, and so on. I will now frame my understanding of economic hardship, defining the nature in Nigeria and drivers of that hardship in Nigeria today, and then finally with strategies that we can implement as households, as a government, and as businesses. So to effectively analyze Nigeria's macro start, let me start by looking at the Nigerian environment in 2024 and the outlook for 2025. To effectively analyze the Nigeria's macroeconomic environment and its prospect for 2025, we must begin by placing it within the broader global and African economic landscape. Nigeria is deeply embedded in the global economy. Our growth, stability, and resilience are influenced by external factors. A lot of that has been said today. Whether it's commodity prices, trade flows, global interest rates, investor sentiment, and geopolitical trends, all of this affect what happens to us domestically because we are very tied into the global macroeconomic environment. The events and policy shifts of 2024 have created a world of profound complexity as we enter 2025. While there was resilience in many markets last year, that resilience is beginning to fray. As we step into 2025, a new set of challenges in the global environment and a few emerging opportunities, the chairman mentioned quite a few, are shaping the terrain on which we must operate as a country. The first global theme in 2024 was a slowing global growth and fragile recovery. Global growth in 2024 came in at 3.1%, modest, but broadly in line with most expectations. This reflects a slow-moving recovery, still grappling with the long-term aftershocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, prolonged supply chain disruptions, high energy costs, and tightening financial conditions. Looking deeper, forward-looking indicators like global purchasing managers' indices show signs of weaknesses and waning confidence. Momentum is softening in almost every major region, setting a precarious tone for 2025. The second key theme was persistent but shifting inflation. Disinflation trends offered cautious optimism since the second half of 2024. However, core inflation remains stubbornly above target, particularly in advanced economies. This is largely due to tight labor markets, elevated energy costs, and renewed supply constraints. As a result, central banks around the world, particularly the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and so on, responded, as we know, with aggressive tightening for most of 2024. Interest rates reached multi-decade highs before beginning a tentative easing cycle last year. But this pause is fragile, and inflationary triggers are re-emerging in 2025. Notably, the return of protectionist policies in the US, like the chairman mentioned, is reshaping trade flows, is raising costs, and is potentially reigniting another round of inflation. For Nigeria, the global shift towards high interest rates could not have come at a more difficult time. External debt servicing already consumes a substantial share of public revenues, and the cost of borrowing is rising just as Nigeria's total debt stock has reached the highest level in its history. Elevated global interest rates constrain refinancing options, they widen debt service obligations, and further squeeze the fiscal space available for critical development spending, particularly in infrastructure, in education, and in health. However, this challenge is far from unique to Nigeria. Rising debt is now a global concern. In 2024, total global debt surged to an unprecedented $300 trillion, with emerging markets disproportionately exposed. According to the World Bank, developing countries collectively spent over $400 billion on external debt servicing last year alone. Nearly 50 nations are now considered to be at high risk of debt distress or outright insolvency. For Nigeria, where debt to GDP ratio, where the debt to GDP ratio is above 50%, the implications are particularly concerning. The challenge lies not merely in the size of the debt stock, but in the composition of debt, in the cost of servicing it, and the country's narrow and volatile revenue base. With limited fiscal buffers, we face interestingly difficult trade-offs. Do we continue allocating scarce resources to service debt obligations, or do we prioritize much-needed investments in infrastructure and social protection? The answer cannot simply be one or the other. What is required, rather, is a dual-track approach, one that emphasizes fiscal discipline and debt transparency while simultaneously advancing structural reforms aimed at boosting domestic revenue, at curbing inefficiencies, and channeling public expenditure towards high impact, productivity enhancing investments. A fourth defining global theme shaping both the international and Nigerian economic outlook in 2025 is the continued weakness in trade and investment flows. Global trade volumes remain subdued throughout 2024. They are likely to even get worse in 2025 with the heightened trade wars currently going on, reflecting the combined effects of heightened geopolitical tensions, persistently high shipping and logistics costs, and an increasingly cautious stance among multinational corporations. Across sectors and geographies, firms have prioritized operational resilience and domestic market consolidation over cross-border expansion and long-term foreign investment. Looking ahead, this pattern is expected to deepen. For Nigeria, an economy heavily dependent on crude oil exports and structurally reliant on imported goods, the contraction in global trade presents significant risks. Export revenues may remain volatile, supply chain disruptions could persist, and the balance of payments will continue to face a lot of strain. Yet, embedded within this risk is also a pivotal opportunity. The fragility of global trade dynamics underscores the urgency of rethinking Nigeria's growth model. We must accelerate the transition from a dependence on external demand towards internally anchored, productivity-driven, towards an internally anchored, productivity-driven economy. This means deepening domestic value chains. It means strengthening local industrial capacity and fostering a more diversified and resilient production base. If approached strategically, this shift could not only enhance economic stability, but also position Nigeria more competitively within regional and global markets over the medium term. Another major theme that defined global markets in 2024 and which remains critical in shaping Nigeria's outlook for 2025 is the heightened volatility in commodity prices. Commodity markets were marked by turbulence throughout the year. Crude oil, Nigeria's primary export, averaged about $80 per barrel, but experienced sharp fluctuations, most notably a 5.6% decline in February 2025. At the same time, gold surged to over $3,000 per ounce as global investors in a heightened, uncertain environment moved towards safe haven assets amid rising uncertainty. For Nigeria, this volatility presents a double-edged sword. First, oil price instability continues to complicate fiscal planning and foreign exchange management. Budget benchmarks become unreliable, revenue projections are routinely missed, and the naira remains vulnerable to external shocks. Second, volatility in global food and fuel markets directly affect domestic inflation. They erode household purchasing power and exacerbate social economic stress. particularly among vulnerable populations already living on the economic margins. Third, and perhaps most strategically, the global energy transition is driving up demand for critical minerals such as lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, many of which Nigeria holds in commercially viable quantities. However, our current regulatory framework, our infrastructure deficits, and weak value chain integration has prevented us from capitalizing on this opportunity. To turn this global shift into a national advantage, Nigeria must urgently reposition its extractive sector. This means making targeted investments in mining infrastructure, enforcing transparent and investor-friendly regulatory regimes, and developing integrated value chains from geological exploration to mineral processing and export. Doing so could not only diversify foreign exchange earnings, but also lay the foundation for new industrial clusters and high-skilled employment. To renewable power infrastructure and clean manufacturing, demand for critical minerals is expected to surge over the next 2 decades. Nigeria, like I mentioned earlier, with its deposits of lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, and so on, is strategically positioned to benefit, but only if we act decisively, like I mentioned. To realize this potential, we must craft a coherent energy transition strategy. We must craft and implement a coherent energy transition strategy that positions the mining sector as a foundational pillar of future industrialization. This requires far more than just simply attracting extractive capital. It means building the enabling infrastructure, power, water, transport corridors, a digital system to support commercial mining and processing operations, establishing clear, transparent, and enforceable regulations to govern exploration licenses, environmental compliance, and community engagement, thereby reducing policy uncertainty and investor risk, investing in value addition and beneficiation to ensure that raw mineral extraction feeds into domestic processing, manufacturing, and export of high-value products, and linking mining development to industrial policy by fostering mineral-based clusters for batteries, solar panels, electronics, and other green technology. If Nigeria gets this right, the mining sector can become a catalyst not only for foreign exchange earnings, but for structural transformation, for regional development, and for global competitiveness in the green economy. Another defining theme, global theme, as we move through 2025, is the continued realignment of global supply chains. The global economy is undergoing a major supply chain transformation. Tensions between the US and China, actually between the US and everyone, are pushing firms to diversify suppliers, favor regional partners, and prioritize resilience over efficiency. This presents a clear strategic opportunity for Africa and for Nigeria in particular. And as global manufacturers seek alternative sourcing and production bases closer to end markets, the continent's demographic advantage, its resource endowment, and emerging common market under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement provide a compelling proposition. For Nigeria, the challenge and the opportunity is to position itself not just as a participant, but as a regional anchor for industrial production, assembly, and logistics. However, ambition must be matched by execution. To harness this opportunity, Nigeria must address a range of persistent supply-side constraints. For example, border inefficiencies and customs bottlenecks continue to delay trade flows and increase the cost of doing business. Also, poor logistics infrastructure, including roads, ports, storage facilities, undermines competitiveness and reliability. Furthermore, security concerns, particularly along key transit corridors, discourage investment in large-scale distribution or manufacturing operations. And finally, fragmented regional infrastructure and policy misalignment weakens the economic coherence needed to truly leverage the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. If Nigeria is to benefit from this global reordering of trade and supply chains, it must undertake deliberate reforms to strengthen its infrastructure backbone. digitize and simplify trade procedures and processes, ensure regulatory predictability, and enhance cross-border coordination with regional partners. Only then can we translate our geographical and economic scale into meaningful industrial advantage. Another global theme is climate disruption. 2024 was marked by unprecedented climate events, from floods to heat waves and droughts. January 2025 was the warmest January ever recorded globally, underscoring the need to treat climate volatility as a core economic risk and not a distant environmental issue. Heat waves disrupted agriculture and construction, driving up food and labor costs. Flooding displaced millions and damaged infrastructure. And climate-sensitive economy, it is especially vulnerable. Climate-resilient agriculture, better irrigation, energy diversification, and stronger infrastructure must become economic, not just environmental priorities. Rising geopolitical tensions is another major theme as we go into 2025. Multiple conflicts around the world have heightened global instability. The Russia-Ukraine crisis, the Israel-Gaza, Lebanon crisis, the China-Taiwan tensions, all have disrupted markets and dampened investor confidence. Even in Africa, disputes between Algeria and Sudan have all hindered trade and regional growth. Nigeria, situated in West Africa, a region now central to geopolitical security and trade, must therefore respond strategically. Regional diplomacy, security cooperation, and economic integration within the ECOWAS and the Continental Free Trade area are now matters of economic survival. Finally, 2024 was also a year of consequential elections. The United States, India, the European Union, across the European Union, Brazil, and others. Transition. Each of these challenges is significant on its own. Together, they create a deeply uncertain and increasingly fractured global economy. For Nigeria and Nigerian policymakers and business leaders, these developments carry clear and urgent implications. Firstly, relying on external demand is no longer viable. Domestic investments and internal growth engines must drive the next phase of Nigeria's development. Secondly, we need a dedicated economic strategy unit, empowered to anticipate global shocks, assess risks within 48 hours, and coordinate a proactive national response. For example, with all these global challenges, has anybody heard of any statement by the economic team, for example, how they're going to deal with it? There's been nothing said about it. Now, that doesn't mean they're not doing anything about it, but it is important for policymakers to send that signal that they're on top of these kind of things. In 2025, there are going to be lots of these disruptions. We need worsening hardships for households and businesses. As a country, we must move from fragility to foresight, from crisis response to crisis anticipation. It is the time for us as a country to double down on structural competitiveness, to rebuild institutional trust, and re-anchor investment strategy on long-term fundamentals. Now, let me quickly turn my attention to Donald Trump and his policy before I narrow it down to the Nigerian economy. I debated very, very strongly whether or not I should discuss this, especially since I don't want to risk my US visa being revoked. I believe that the election of Donald Trump is arguably the most critical geopolitical development of concern for the world and the Nigerian economy in 2025. For Africa and for Nigeria, this outcome represents a recalibration of strategic priorities across trade, investment, and diplomacy. And as I unpack the implications, I'll focus on how these shifts will affect our positioning within the global economy and what proactive steps we can take as a country. But to first understand the direction of the global economy, we need to first understand the key drivers behind Trump's re-election. His re-election was powered by nationalist, as we know, economic sentiment and a strong push for protectionism. That's what he was elected for, and that's exactly what he's doing. These domestic drivers are a signal that U.S. foreign policy will lean even more heavily towards bilateralism and reduce global entanglements. For Africa and Nigeria, this orientation means less multilateral engagements and more transactional diplomacy. Accordingly, I anticipate a rise in global trade uncertainty that's already happening, a rise in and heightened financial volatility that's already happening. The U.S. inward turn could Let me now talk about Trump's energy policies and how they have impacted how they would impact global oil markets and African economies, particularly Nigeria. Now, during his first term, his emphasis on energy independence led to massive increase in U.S. oil production, which in turn fueled significant volatility in oil prices. This is already happening. Take Brent crude as an example. In his first term, prices dropped from $66 per barrel in January 2019 demand and price declines. This reinforces the urgency of diversifying our exports and leveraging, like I mentioned earlier, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. There's also the potential reduction in U.S. support for regional security efforts like counterterrorism. It will place greater pressure on Nigeria to combat groups like Boko Haram, ISWAP, and with fewer external resources. Also, a decline in U.S. foreign direct investment in infrastructure, technology, and energy highlights the arguably bold and, in many cases, overdue economic reforms. It marked the onset of a deliberate shift towards a more rules-based, market-oriented economic framework. However, that shift came at a significant cost. It was a year of profound socio-economic hardship for millions of Nigerians, many of whom experienced worsening living conditions, eroded purchasing power, and diminished access to essential services. Reality, often painful and disorienting. The posture from policymakers often seems to be, it will pass, endure it, but that approach alienates people, it erodes trust, and it undermines support for reform, no matter how well intentioned. As leaders, we must understand that reform is not simply about necessity and courage to keep faith with them. It is also about compassion and calibration. Despite the difficulties, 2024 laid the groundwork for a rules-based modern economic system. Some of the key reforms introduced in the year, as you all are aware, the comprehensive tax legislation, the foreign currency repatriation schemes, the aggressive monetary tightening. Only about sequencing perfection. It is also about strategizing, about strategic prioritization, consistent execution, and above all, clarity of purpose, doing the right things at the right time for the right reasons. Despite significant macroeconomic headwinds, Nigeria reported modest GDP growth in 2024. You will notice my careful phrasing, reportedly recorded, Asia General of the National Bureau of Statistics. But I will not elaborate further, and I trust you understand why. But like I said, modest GDP growth. However, despite this growth, the lived experience of most Nigerians was one of economic deterioration. Inflation stood at beyond oil into manufacturing and services, reducing its vulnerability to commodity shocks. Rwanda emphasized governance, policy states growing on the continent. And Brazil, as one more example, through programs like Bolsa Familia, demonstrated how social protection can serve as a macroeconomic stabler, not just as a welfare tool. These stories converge around three strategic pillars, each of which Nigeria must internalize, adapt, and implement at scale. The first pillar is macroeconomic stability. Macroeconomic stability is not an outcome, it's a prerequisite. Nigeria must rebuild investor and citizen confidence by addressing fiscal imbalances, taming inflation, and restoring exchange rate credibility. The second pillar is economic diversification. Diversification is no longer optional. Nigeria's dependence on oil exposed base markets and modernized regulation to ensure finance serves the real economy, and also green and digital transition to position Nigeria to lead in renewable energy, climate resilient, and jobs. In conclusion, let me reaffirm a central truth. Nigeria has the raw ingredients for greatness. The potential is well recognized. Our large and youthful population, our abundant natural resources, and a geostrategic position at the crossroads of Africa and global trade. But let us be clear, potential is not a strategy. Execution is. The path of economic resilience, inclusive prosperity, and reducing economic hardship is neither quick nor easy, but it is clear. We know what needs to be done. In fact, doing this presentation was very easy because everything I've said today, and that's what we keep doing. We keep
Please put your hands together for her if she's here. Yes. Of Nigeria. Please put your hands together for him. Let me also welcome Chief Davison Alaribe, who is the president of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria.
Chairman and the keynote speaker. I believe they have kept us sitting down for over 2 hours. And from a head perspective, I'm not sure. So if you don't mind, you can just stand up and sit down just so you can follow the panel session very, very well. So if you can just, Chairman, I was saying this is a fantastic keynote address. That indeed, we are going to organize another Vanguard economic discourse, and that one will be purely only for Ogadele to be the keynote. Because he spoke on so many things. And Dr. Yemi Kale also came and started giving us statistics from global to Africa to every. And people sitting on my back were saying, hey, we've been hearing this thing, we've been hearing this thing, we've been hearing this thing. And interestingly, Yemi now said that these things that he just copied it from. Somebody said the problem with Nigeria, is it a spiritual problem? And many people will argue that if we've been hearing the same thing, and we've not changed, it seems that it's spiritual. Because, you know, we've been going to church every Sunday, midweek service, even early week service. We all go to mosque, but the problem remains. So, but interestingly, we have very eminent panel members. I will not bother you by reading out their profiles, because some people's profiles are already public knowledge. And if you look at the caliber of people we have from our own Economic and Recovery and Growth Plan, Vision 2050, now Renewed Hope Agenda, we seem to be, poverty is getting worse. We are borrowing almost 50 trillion in a year. Inflation is skyrocketing, and many other challenges. So my question to you is, what is the issue?
So the first thing is how you define a problem to a great extent determines whether you can solve it. Nigeria's problems are economic, but they are not first economic. The economics of our problem is a subset of how we have defined the problem. So the problem is by a certain type of leadership. You were discussing prayer a few minutes ago. One of the scriptures from one of the holy books says that where there is no the political transition, the plan is thrown away, and a new government comes in and it starts afresh. The nations we are discussing, back to your benchmark, succeeded in prosecuting development agendas over the longer term. So political institutions must own national development agendas where all of us have reached a consensus of the vision and all of us are committed, in spite of political transitions, to go on that journey together. Now, once you don't have that, just imagine under PDP governed Nigeria from 1999 to 2015 as a ruling party. Not as as the ruling party. Under that ruling party, we had the Vision 2020. Under the ruling party, the government after that pursued a 7-point agenda that started moving away from the Vision 2020. Under that government, a vice president of a cabinet where the president died, as soon as the president died, moved from 7-point agenda to transformation agenda. And so the inability to prosecute our consensus around what is development in Nigeria, how do you deliver it, where does it go, is the problem. So you then come to targets like double-digit growth. We've seen double-digit growth since the potential to be 12 economies in the world. Potential is not our problem. On potential, Nigeria will go to heaven. The problem is when you want to convert our potential to outcomes, measurable, tangible outcomes that matter to you and I, you must deliver leaders that can run institutions. Institutions execute policy. In fact, if you hand an agenda to an institution that has no capacity, nothing will happen. Institutions execute policy. Now, institutions also develop policy. If you have an institution that cannot convert a political agenda, no matter how nicely it was promised, to policies that match the internal and external environment and can execute, it will fail. So President Buhari's administration was social protection in Nigeria did not automatically translate into benefit for citizens. So we fail not at the idea. We fail not at the agenda. We fail because the quality of leadership and the quality of institutions that need the capacity to execute has a huge deficit, and if we don't solve that deficit, many promises of Nigeria will not become reality.
Excellent. Can we give him a round of applause, please? That is an evil spirit. Because it means that at the point of execution, that evil spirit comes in as elite consensus to agree that this is right. Whether you are talking about next 11 or next this or next that, to stand up, Africa Rising will become a big reality. So my question, so Dr. also been engaging with the economy, with the government, with the populace, with the private sector and all that. With all that we've heard from the chairman, from the keynote speaker, and from Dr. Tayo, is it still possible, from your own assessment, to craft a fiscal policy that will help us to address the current, ongoing, and emerging challenges? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this very important discourse. Yes, it is extremely very important that we get our fiscal policies right.
New generation. That is why each time the customs talk or the National Assembly is engaging the customs, the conversation is always about the target on revenue. And this kind of mindset has a way of putting unnecessary pressure on businesses. So it is very, very important from a trade policy perspective to use tariff instruments to support investment. The tariff regime in Nigeria is too high. Even for sectors where we don't have capacity for raw materials, for inputs, is something on which we need to poverty and building an economy that is inclusive. So we need to have a framework of how the government will intervene in such areas as energy, in our health sector, in our education sector, and some other critical and public transportation. Now we have a system, we don't have sufficient public transportation system. You go through our roads, all the buses are rickety buses. Why are they so rickety? They are rickety because the import duty you pay to be able to import a bus, put it on the road, is getting close to 20-25%. All charges put together. If you take that alone, based on prevailing exchange rates, it's compounding the problem. So government intervention in critical sectors is extremely very important to support agriculture, to support infrastructure, to support manufacturing, and to support other critical sectors so that we don't create unnecessary problems and create too much challenges for the economy. Thank you.
That the oil subsidy was more or less a conduct for embezzlement, corruption, and all that. And they said that subsidy should be removed. And the government removed the subsidy. We also said that the best thing to do is to look at the naira and maybe allow market forces to determine the exchange rate, which the government did and floated the naira. But I'm hearing now from Muda Yusuf that maybe the government should also come again to start addressing some of these things, to allow it to the market again. Let me bring Samande. From your own experience, or observing or experimenting or seeing what is going on in Nigeria, looking at the reforms, will you consider the reforms to be positive, negative to the private sector or to your firm?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Franklin, thank you so much for your question. But I would like to just beg your indulgence. I share this story with you. It was a humid, very, very humid evening in the factory, and it was 8 p.m. in the evening. The factory was incredibly silent. Our artisans, all 25 of them, were sitting idle, doing nothing. Yet we had a huge consignment that was due to be in Uganda in a matter of 6 weeks. We were already running incredibly behind on our deliveries. The client was incredibly impatient, very frustrated with us. But unfortunately for us, our team were incredibly overworked. We had spent several weeks sourcing raw materials, delivering various different samples to the client, both their local representations and their international representations. We had spent weeks testing materials, making samples in the factory. But in this particular evening, 8 p.m., predominantly diesel throughout a year, our global competitors are averaging less than 10% on energy for their production lines. Every single blackout that we experience in Lagos, in Nigeria, equals a loss in profit, it equals fewer jobs, and it equals stunted growth for the average SME manufacturer or business owner. My personal experience of this has been high cost of diesel. I'm sure you can hear from my accent, I didn't grow up in Nigeria. I came here because I had a dream of manufacturing in Africa and exporting to a global market. And I'm sharing with you a little bit. Thank you. I'm sharing with you a little bit because that experience so far has been distracted by incredibly high power resources that I have to